Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Thoughts on Film podcast. My name is Scott Morris and I will be joined later on by Craig Eastman and Andrew Tavendale, but first a little bit of a mea culpa. For various reasons we've not been able to bring you our regularly scheduled episode at this time, so we've decided to take a little bit of a walk down memory lane with this very special episode. Yeah, sadly it's a clip show, but this is a selection of some of our favourite reviews from the first year of our podcast. So we do know from listener statistics that a lot of you have been joining us lately, and welcome aboard. We hope you find something new to enjoy here, and if you have been with us from the start, well, firstly, thank you very much for that, and secondly, you are excused for this class and you may go and contemplate something beautiful for an hour and a half instead. We're going to start off with a review from our December 2015 show on Takeshi Kitano, and we're going to talk about Violent Cop. The first film that he both directed and played had bit parts, and I think this might be his first major role, certainly in anything dramatic rather than comedic. It was, of course, the aforementioned Violent Cop. Perhaps worth doing a little bit of scene setting here. I believe I still saw this first when I was towards the end of my high school career, and in those days we had in Britain access to 4 television channels, maybe 5. I forget if Channel 5 had launched by that point, but films films were not thick on the ground unless you had satellite or cable, which I didn't. So trying to find any film that was a little bit out of the ordinary is kind of difficult. You were left limited to when something like BBC Two showed some of their Movie-Drome stuff that was fronted by Alex Cox, or I think it then became Mark Cousins. I seem to remember Mark Kermode doing some of them, but I may be misremembering that.
I only remember the Alex Cox years because that introduced me to Assault on Precinct 13.
So it was a lot of interesting films like that, and the Cronenberg stuff, which was of course like Scanners. I think was the first time I saw that was part of a Movie-Drome thing. Yeah. So it was also the time when I first started seeing some anime, which some at the time was very influential for me. Things like Akira was shown on Channel 4. Channel
4 sort of were the only sort of media outlet in the UK to get anything like an early handle on that stuff, right? We were picking up stuff like, you say, like Akira, and some of the episodic stuff like Cyber City, showing late night on Channel 4, but like really late night. Yeah, Legend of the Four Kings, Wicked City, all that stuff. It was almost impossible. I mean, certainly for me at the time, we had in Falkirk, our hometown, we had one cinema that had 3 screens and was not going to be showing anything like the sort of art house stuff that even you can get in multiplexes these days. Actually, folks like Cineworld having a bit more of a broader outlook, but you couldn't get that. I didn't have even if they did show it, I didn't have the money to go and see that or rent any of the films like that, so it was limited to what was showing on TV. And lo and behold, at some point Channel 4 did a Japanese film little series which included some stuff that has haunted me to the day, things like Shinji Tsukamoto's Tetsuo and Tetsuo 2, and then Violent Cop, which blew my mind as a kid. Absolutely astonishing film. It took me a long time to parse Violent Cop. I must have watched that VHS. I don't even think the first time I watched it all the way through. I kind of had to give up and go back again.
Yeah.
Violent Cop is as interesting a film as any in that, to this day it's actually still, I think, probably my favourite Takeshi film. Some of that's probably down to the whole honeymoon thing. But basically, and I suppose the closest comparison you could draw with a Western movie is, I suppose it's kind of a Japanese update of Dirty Harry.
Yes.
But that's not to say that you will recognise much of Dirty Harry in it. It very much establishes Takeshi's trademark style, certainly so far as his Yakuza and or sort of gangster movies are concerned. We'll touch on some of the other stuff he's done later on, because he does have 2 very distinct veins of filmmaking. But as pertains to his gangster stuff, he kind of sets his stall out here early, and I think it was Kinji Fukasaku who was supposed to originally direct this, but fell ill.
Yes.
So Kitano basically took the reins, did a fairly heavy script rewrite, and we've ended up with this mesmeric piece about a police officer who is very quick to use violence as a tool, as leverage in pretty much any situation. And while he's undergoing an investigation into a series of homicides which are related to drug dealing in his home city, he discovers that one of his colleagues, with whom he's quite close, has actually been supplying drugs from within the police. So he ends up being murdered, and Azuma finds himself torn between sort of that situation with pursuing the guys who are responsible for murdering his corrupt partner, but also the fact that his sister has been kidnapped as well and is being used in many senses of the word by one of the guys who's responsible. And I think the reason I found this so difficult to parse, there are several reasons. One, at this point in my life, and I'm thinking I must have been around 15, 16, I hadn't understood that filmmaking could be quite this bleak.
Yes.
And to this day, I have in my personality a fairly nihilistic bent to a certain degree and in certain situations, which I hold this film directly responsible for. It's the first film I think I saw where I understood that in storytelling, sometimes the best story is one where nobody gets away clean, where there are absolutely no happy endings to be had, and that actually violence begets violence in a very real sense, and that if you are willing to use that level of violence upon people, you had better be prepared to receive a similar level of violence upon thyself. It's also the first time that it's kickstarted my appreciation of stillness in cinema as well. Yes. Because for all that Takeshi's gangster films rely... Well, so I suppose the yin and yang of his gangster films is that he balances moments of often unexpected but almost always spectacular violence with great swathes of 35mm film, which essentially are just a copy and paste of one frame of his face. He's quite happy to let the camera sit on his untwitching face for a good couple of minutes. That could be in any number of situations. He's very much a practitioner of stillness, which makes a very interesting contrast and actually makes those moments of violence, those punctuations of violence, all the more spectacular. It's mesmerising in a way that one can't necessarily qualify all that well. Right from the off, you start seeing what his auteurism is going to be, if you like. You can see that he's, he said publicly, he's no fan of seeing people talk while the camera's swivelling around a room or anything like that. That's why you get these very long shots of people conversing. There's nothing particularly going on. There's none of the kind of reverse face thing that you might have in quite a lot of the Western stuff. He's perfectly happy to have people just walk into the camera for about 2 minutes and then walk away from the camera for another 3 minutes. As long as that's sort of telling the kind of, it's hitting the pacing that he needs to get out the rest of the story. And I wonder how much of that comes from his comedy background, because a lot of this film has, and basically you can apply this to almost every film that he's done, has this incredible sense of timing in a way that really sort of punctuates the beats of the dramatic impulses of it much better than almost any Western film I've seen to this point. Not to say that there aren't them, of course, but at this point in my career I hadn't seen them, and this really blew me away. That's just the pacing of it, the way that it can be so still for so long and have lots of stretches where there's not really much going on. No, not even dialogue. No, another hallmark of Takeshi's style. I think he would be happier if he could just direct films with no dialogue in them at all, and he's come close to doing that on a few occasions, and there's not really an awful lot in Violent Cop. No. He would much rather explain things, as you say, just by facial expressions and little glances, these things like that. He's far more subtle of a storyteller than you would think, given the comedy background that he comes from. He's immense in that respect. And sometimes even without the emotion, bizarrely, I mean, I can think of a couple of scenes in Violent Cop, one of them being, I suppose, the scene where someone attempts to stab him in the street, and he'll quite happily have these scenes, and again, there's something absolutely mesmeric about it. And it sounds a bizarre thing to say about something so intrinsically violent, but there's a scene where a guy tries to stab him, and he turns around and he grabs a hold of his knife with his hand, with his bare hand. And the two of them stand there for a good sort of 10-15 seconds just staring unblinkingly at each other. And not just unblinkingly, but completely dispassionately. No care one way or another on either of their faces, except for the fact, I think the guy trying to stab him's chewing a matchstick, which he may continue chewing, or he may sort of pause chewing it, I'm not sure. And it's the strangest thing, and it's not even some sort of cultural divide, it's very much Takeshi's style. It's not necessarily that he's trying to say something through that. There's just something inherently cinematic about just in a situation like that, allowing the enormity of what's happening almost to disappear into the background and just to focus on two really interesting faces. And this essentially like a massive battle of wills, but just completely unspoken, completely silent, almost emotionless. It's bizarre. Yeah, it does occasionally lapse into what would seem to be a kind of something stolen from Western films. It's almost like he will do a Mexican standoff, even if it's just people talking to each other, which somehow shouldn't work, but it really does. He manages to pull off this tremendous sense of drama from really nothing happening, which is an incredible feat. Yeah, I hadn't seen anything at all like it at the time, and it just, as I say, blew my doors of my mind apart. Yeah. I think in a lot of it is to do with the casting. I mean, I'm not sure how involved he is in the casting, but he's certainly worked with one or two other actors regularly throughout his career. Whether or not he's directly involved, I'm not sure, but there's a real knack in his films for casting people just really interesting characters to look at.
Yeah.
As shallow as that sounds, a lot of even sort of incidental characters in these films, and I think about almost all of the characters in Violent Cop, he works with a group of actors who are just really fantastic at working with it and rolling with the way he likes to work, and who are equally as happy at sort of just minute upon minute of just stillness and silence. I think about the scene near the end of the film where the three guys are standing in the warehouse while the chap, I forget his name, while he's loading the guns, telling them, look, he's coming, there's no point in running. This isn't going to work out well for any of us. And there's a good sort of 2-3 minutes where the guys are just standing there contemplating their fate, and nobody's saying anything. There's a couple of 1,000-yard stares there, and it's just this wonderful, wonderful sort of facial expression. Well, you have to see it to understand it.
Yeah, and if you've not seen it, this is perhaps a spoiler, but again, it's just an ending which blew my mind, which I was not expecting. You've mentioned the bleakness of it, which I don't think I'd seen anything quite so downbeat as this. But I mean, even the way it plays with your expectations, and really it subverts what you would expect an ending like this to be, because you may think this is all building to some sort of climactic showdown between the protagonist and the antagonist, and actually, you're wrong. Without spoiling it, other parties intervene, and you're left with something that is in no way satisfying in the kind of narrative sense that you would expect it to be if this was a more conventionally plotted film. But that really made it all the more impactful for me.
Yeah. And also I think it touches on something, that the lack of a happy ending thing. Also, what's important is that as a viewer, you sort of implicitly understand that although that's not the ending maybe you were hoping for, and whether or not you were actually rooting for Takeshi's character, as to whether or not he's someone likeable enough, despite his largely, I suppose, his good intentions as a police officer. The mechanics of how he goes about his work don't necessarily make him sympathetic or likeable in any way. But there's a very implicit understanding as a member of the audience that although this might not be the ending you wanted, it's the ending that was deserved for all of these people. And even to this day, I mean, just watching it again in the last couple of days there, for the first time in a few years actually, I still was struck by just how bleak an ending that is, and actually how mesmeric and well paced, and actually although it's violent, also in a lot of ways subtle, and affecting that ending really is. Even to this day, having seen quite a few films now which have, I suppose, tried to ape that style and that nihilistic sensibility, then yes, I think it still stands head and shoulders above a lot of those films, and it's still my favourite Takeshi film, I think. I
would want to pick between it and other films for some of it, but it's certainly very high up there. In terms of impact that it's had on my life, there's probably no other film that has affected what I watch in cinema or how I think about how cinema works as Violent Cop has. And for that reason alone, it's just a tremendous way to introduce yourself to Takeshi Kitano if you haven't done already. Thankfully, there's now a quarter-way decent DVD release. I don't think it's been able to release on Blu-ray. A lot of Takeshi Kitano's stuff is not available on Blu-ray, which is a crying shame. But yes, if you have not seen it, it's certainly well worth picking up and watching. It's an incredible bit of filmmaking, and something that I think everyone really should be seeing.
Yes, I would agree, and it's a great introduction to the style, certainly of his gangster movies. You will know after watching this film whether or not you are going to like Takeshi Kitano's work. But even if it's something that you don't necessarily gel with on a first viewing, I would implore people to watch it again and see if they can pick up on the rhythm of it. Not to be patronising, but there's definitely a rhythm and a style there that it might take a while for people to settle into that gear. But I think when you do, it can be massively rewarding and so unlike anything else out there that you'll have come across in the mainstream.
Our next review is from our January 2016 episode on David Lynch, the famed American author, one of our more popular episodes. So we hope you enjoy this as we start to talk about Eraserhead. We'll just dive in straight with the first film, his first feature film, Eraserhead, which already has shown many of the hallmarks of the Lynch experience, if you like.
And how. Yeah. So shall I take it?
Go.
Yeah, go. Take it, boy. Eraserhead, in which Jack Nance plays Henry Spencer, an employee of a local printer's who lives his solitary life amongst an oppressive industrialist hellscape shot in muted black and white. And you will know immediately by that sentence whether or not this film is going to appeal to you. One day, Henry answers the door of his apartment to Mary X, an ex-girlfriend, who invites Henry to dinner at her parents' house. Once there, Henry is party to, amongst other things, a bizarre dinner of oozing baby chickens, sudden amorous advances of Mary's mother, and the revelation that Mary has, in the interim betwixt the conclusion of her relationship with Henry, given premature birth to his mutant child. If the first sentence didn't put you off, I'm wondering if you're still with us at the conclusion of the second. Basically, what follows is an intensely unsettling and unhinged procession of events that begins with the strain placed on the now newlywed Jack and Mary's relationship by the incessantly unsettled infant, progressing through occasional glimpses of the theatre stage, apparently hidden behind Henry's radiator. Scenes of an astral body tumbling through the void and interacting with fetus-like organisms. Sparse conversations in the hallway betwixt Henry and his sultry neighbour, and occasional sojourns into the decaying cityscape through which Henry ambles, often Chaplin-like, I felt, to the constant strains of a noise-driven ambience that unsettles and infuriates in equal measure. If all of that sounds indecipherable to you, then that's because Lynch's debut feature is a maniac's manifesto that begins under a layer of abstraction and spirals increasingly into unfathomable insanity with each progressive frame. Unlike Lynch's later movies where he breaks his audience in more subtly, Eraserhead kind of asks you within 30 seconds, are you on board with this?
Yeah.
And while that's a question posed by most of Lynch's movies, I also feel like most of them wait at least 60 seconds before setting out that stall. It's long revered as the quintessential midnight movie, which is where it sort of garnered popularity. Lynch spent something like 6 years making this film.
At least 5, yeah.
Yeah, at least 5. During which process his director of cinematography died. Whether or not that's related directly to the film, I'm not sure. In the world of Lynch, nothing is impossible. And it sort of garnered this massive, massive cult status through midnight movie showings before it became, or rather it asserted itself as a classic of modern cinema. You will know within 5 minutes whether you're going to need a second pass at this. And I most certainly do. Certainly before I feel even remotely qualified in passing judgment. I feel like I came to Eraserhead with a huge burden of expectation. It's one of those touchstone films that really kind of defines the modern lexicon of cinema, and based on my enjoyment of a great deal of Lynch's other works to varying degrees, I assumed that I was going to come to Eraserhead and immediately click with it.
Yeah.
And it is by far his most outlandish movie. I think if anything, it suffers from this is my first film and I'm going to throw every idea I've ever had at the screen syndrome. But I didn't engage with Eraserhead. I'm going to be honest. I don't feel like I enjoyed it on this first viewing, and it sounds like you might be in agreement.
Yeah, it's easily the hardest of Lynch's films to watch, and given what else this man has done, that is actually saying something.
Wow, yeah.
It is a film I have struggled to engage with on a number of occasions. I believe I first picked up a copy of this sometime during my student career, having seen some of his rather more accessible stuff at that point. And given the reputation like yourself, I was expecting it to be something really quite special, but I found quite a lot of it to be actually a bit dull. I found it very difficult to engage with anything at all. It's one of the few times I've just admitted defeat and stopped watching it. Indeed, until a few days ago, I hadn't watched it all the way through to the end. Twice, at least, and I clearly remember I've started watching this with all good intentions and just given up after 40 minutes or so. This last time was I felt compelled to watch it all the way through to the end, but I don't really think it's either enlightened me a great deal or has really enhanced my enjoyment of it. There's a very common position that you could take about David Lynch, and that is that his films are nonsense. Right? There is.
It's hard to argue against.
Yes, I mean, right. You can. It's of course aided by this ethos because he is so impenetrable. He will not give any information away. He doesn't even talk. Yeah. He doesn't like talking about his films. I mean,
exactly. Not least of all, right? Because when approached about it himself, more often than not, he just kind of shrugs his shoulders and goes, "Eh."
Yes, and he's one of these characters. I mean, he doesn't like talking about pretty much anything. I believe he's some early. I was reading something about his earlier years. He almost didn't talk for the first 20 years of his life. He's very minimalist in what he tries to say, and that obviously comes across in all the dialogue and throughout his works. But it's especially prevalent here. A great many elements in his films are just simply never explained. They're inexplicable in the very real sense of just there is no way this would happen. This could happen. There's no logical explanation for any of it, and it's not films that are based on logic, but
you
can't
use that as a
tool.
of this. No, of course, we're going to spend a lot of this podcast talking about dream logic.
Yes.
Which is the thing that he sort of evokes the most, but this isn't so much of a dream as a nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly pictured more as some sort of, well, I mean, it's psychological horror, I guess, more than anything else, because there's very few things that are outright scary, apart from just this unsettling, unnerving tone that's created, and quite effectively in several places. But it's not enough to really hang the rest of the film on, and it is too outre for the rest of it. There's so much things going on that just kind of bring you out of it, that work against the kind of oppressive nature that it's trying to build up in places where I think it might be more effective. There's too many silly bits. I don't know why there's a theatre between the radiator and there, and I don't know why there's a woman that looks a bit like a hamster singing there. There's just things that are thrown in that have no meaning and no symbolism or anything like that. And for that, it's a bit weak.
And I know that the sort of the accepted reading of this is that it's about Lynch's fear of becoming a father, which is kind of poo-pooed by the fact that he was a father before he started producing this. So perhaps more a reflex to having become a father and a fear of fatherhood. And I can kind of get where people are coming with that. But with anything that David Lynch does, like I say, he refuses to engage in discourse around any of his films, and on any number of occasions has basically said it's whatever you want it to be. And if he himself refuses to define his movies as anything, it's very, very difficult to accept any one particular notion of what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
You're really taking everything on faith. I mean, the opening of this movie, I made notes as I was watching this, right? And I would also give you the caveat that when I say I didn't really engage with this movie, I was watching it on an iPad, it's never going to be the most ideal situation to watch a movie in.
Yeah, and I'm sure one that Lynch has specifically called out against doing on many occasions.
Yes, exactly. So I will pay this film the courtesy of going back and watching it on a bigger screen. But literally like 6 minutes of nothing for an opening. It could be a meteor spinning through space. It could be David Lynch's lunch. Either way, I, and probably he himself, would implore you not to think too much about it. It's like a lot of his other cinema, and actually more, I feel like he kind of does a bit of a leapfrog from this, and he comes back around. He sort of goes to a slightly tamer material for a lot of his studio stuff, and then sort of comes back to this more pervasive sort of dream environment in more recent films. But you will always find that a David Lynch film seems to be going for atmosphere, or certainly in most cases anyway, where he hasn't adapted his work from other material. There's this atmosphere that I feel he's trying to aim for in a lot of his films, and the difference with Eraserhead is that it seems to want to attack you with that atmosphere rather than envelop you in it. It's like he wants it to be this thing. There's this pervasive background audio all through the film that's this sort of industrial mishmash of noise, and like sometimes it resolves itself visually. Like there's a sound that sounds like someone tuning in a radio to like a just off station that's broadcasting solely screeching bats, and that turns out to be a litter of pups suckling at their mother's teat, right? And then other times it doesn't, such as like throughout the early part of the film where he's in, I want to say in his own apartment, and or possibly just his girlfriend's apartment or his ex-girlfriend's parents' house. There's this background noise which sounds, I've made a note here, it sounds akin to a woman being tortured at the far end of a mile-long copper pipe. It's this really, like he really wants to unsettle you with this, and he's throwing this stuff at you and and I almost feel like he overbuilds the atmosphere in this one, and I almost like completely disengaged from it because it was too dense and it was too oppressive.
Yeah, it's a hard ask. In all the ones that of sort of a similar ilk that I enjoy, you're eased far more gently into it, and it has a time to kind of creep up around you, and it's at its best when it sneaks up on you and you don't really, you're not aware of what's going to, the thing that's about to unfold until it's already too late and you're already sucked into it. Whereas this is just slamming you headfirst into a brick wall from the first frame. Yeah. And it's a hard ask. Now, I've got to say, I don't like Eraserhead. I don't think it's anything like his best work. However, as a historical document and as a manifesto of what he's going to do, it's certainly important. You can see an awful lot of things in here that he'll return to time and time again. Arguably much better. However, it's certainly you can't argue the fact that he's setting out his stall early on in his career and showing you exactly what he intends to do when he gets autonomy to do it.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, there are bits of this that works, but where I find it tends to work the best are in the slightly more subtle interactions, like if you put aside all the sort of perverse imagery that permeates this, the couple of exchanges that he has with his neighbour across the hall, who's this amazing, like stunning woman it's so difficult to define, but his interaction with her is really subtle, and there's this almost menacing tone to the way in which she's. Yeah. The best way I can describe it is like a menacing sexuality.
Yeah.
To the way that she engages with him, and very like this woman is only ever lit by apparently a single candle.
Yeah.
Like if you're, I was trying to think of how to describe it earlier, and the only way I can think is if you're a fan of film photography and you know anything about Ansel Adams' zone system, this woman is exposed constantly at zone 2. If you understand that, there you go. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. This really strange, and there's a very, when he's being subtly unnerving like that in Henry's interaction with his neighbour, I find it's more successful than when he's throwing the oblique imagery at the screen. There's obviously, I mean, the mutant child is obviously its own thing, and it's like indecipherable.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the sort of constantly repeated imagery of the sort of the theme of the fetus, as you mentioned, like on the stage, there's a performance which is repeated to varying degrees by a young woman with bizarrely puffed out cheeks, who I almost want to say that I almost took away from it that she was supposed to be his daughter or like his child, were it to develop to adulthood or something like that. That is a wild guess on my part, but the stuff like that, like the bizarreness of there being a theatre stage behind his radiator and stuff, it's just far too oblique.
It's partly what I find infuriating in the Lynch films that I don't like, is that it's so open-ended to interpretation that, you know, and by design, this could mean anything, but because it could mean anything, it actually means nothing. Yeah. And I get a lot of it is, it's like an entire film full of symbols but not symbolic of anything, just symbolic in general. And it doesn't really wind up saying anything at the end of the day. It's a great thing to analyse. I mean, it's almost like it's bait for, film criticism classes, because you can go to town on almost any Lynch film with any interpretation you like, and to be fair, it's probably as valid as anyone else's.
Down for it.
Yes. But it doesn't help. In a lot of ways, I am quite a traditional film goer. I like stories. I like stories to have beginnings, middles, and ends that more or less tie up. And for an awful lot of things in David Lynch's work, you're not going to get that. You're going to get something that can make more sense on emotional levels rather than narrative, and the best of his films achieve that, and when it does manage to have all that tied together, it works fantastically well and better than, almost any other bit of cinema you'll see. But when it whiffs, it becomes a big steaming pile of nonsense, and it's very easy at some point for your brain just to go, nope, not playing with this anymore, and just watching it for the objective nonsense that it is. I don't mean that particularly pejoratively, but it doesn't make sense. And Eraserhead's kind of the poster child for me for that. It doesn't make sense.
I'm reassured, but I kind of knew that. I mean, we haven't discussed this previously to now. And I'm reassured, but I kind of knew that you were going to feel the same way about it. For the handful of films that we've disagreed on over the years, I knew you were going to agree with me on Eraserhead. It's very much its own thing, and more power to him for setting out his manifesto so clearly in the first place. But yeah, it feels kind of like oversaturated thematically, and it's abstraction upon abstraction, and it's one of those things, it's almost impossible to even begin unpicking it. But as you say, it's very much as an object of interest in terms of plotting out this guy's career, is an essential piece of his canon, and you can't really talk about Lynch without talking about Eraserhead, and well, we've done that now.
We move forward to our March 2016 episode, where we talk about the career of Stanley Kubrick, and here we are talking about his excellent Dr. Strangelove.
So moving swiftly on from Lolita to Dr. Strangelove in 1964, and I am ashamed to say that again, until 2 nights ago, I had somehow circumvented watching Doctor Strangelove up until this point in my life.
I'm actually really glad it's worked out that way. Because I watched Doctor Strangelove a long time ago and absolutely loved it. But every time I've gone back to it, it's not the sort of comedy that really gains a lot on repeat viewing. So I would be able to talk about it now and tell you how much I like it, but I couldn't bring the kind of enthusiasm which I hope that you'll be able to bring to it, having just seen it for the first time.
I was absolutely blown away. No pun intended. By the thematic content of this movie. But obviously, broadly, I knew exactly what Doctor Strangelove was, as I suspect a lot of people who haven't seen the movie do. It's very much one of those sort of touchstone movies of the modern era, and I was pleasantly surprised almost to find that it was every bit as good as I've been told, although I can understand what you're saying about perhaps maybe on repeat viewing one might not take as much away. But fascinating to see that it probably to this day probably remains the darkest satire on war ever committed to celluloids. And reteaming the director was Sterling Hayden, who plays Brigadier General Jack D. Ripper. There's a fantastic line of character naming in this, of which my favourite is Bat Guano. Yeah. Which had me chuckling childishly for a good 5 minutes before I'd even started watching the film. I'm not
sure it really beats out General Buck Turgidson.
No. It's amazing. But Jack D. Ripper is an unhinged US Air Force Base commander obsessed with the creeping communist threat, and who's
to our bodily fluids,
to our precious bodily fluids, whose aircraft are currently deployed on a nuclear-armed exercise just outside of Soviet airspace, and who takes it upon himself to sever all communication between his base and the outside world. And subsequently issues his aircraft with a non-retractable order to commence nuclear bombing of Russia, leaving his baffled colleagues within the military and government merely an hour to save the world from Armageddon. If that sounds as though it's far too dark a subject matter to make light of, then consider that this film was produced pretty much at the height of the Cold War, when people were genuinely living their lives in fear of nuclear Armageddon. And yeah, Kubrick thought the best way to handle that, and he's probably right in retrospect, but was to basically step up and have a right good laugh at the situation. Strangelove makes just as damning a case against the insanity of following orders at all costs as did Paths of Glory 7 years previously, I would argue, albeit from a very different end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
I was so engaged by this movie for every minute, and I'll tell you what the biggest surprise to me was having only really lived Strangelove vicariously through other people who have seen it and raved about it over the years. The people's touchstone for this movie is always cited as being Peter Sellers and the fact that he took on 3 key and very different roles within this movie. And on more than one occasion, I've been told, it's Peter Sellers' show. He's the film's engine entirely. And the greatest pleasure for me in watching Dr. Strangelove was to actually find out that is a total disservice to the rest of the central cast, who are uniformly excellent. And I'll tell you in particular, Sterling Hayden, who I wasn't expecting that comic turn from, and who is absolutely note perfect in dialogue, in posture, in every aspect of his performance. It was such a thoroughly enjoyable movie dealing with such a terrible subject matter. And, in such a preposterous lampooning style that you can't really take it seriously. But I can absolutely see why this is on so many people's sort of top 10 movies lists. And there's a very real danger that I suppose it could find its way into my own top 10. But I'll have to give it some further watches, Scott. But really absolutely fascinating that Kubrick, again, not in the sense that Lolita was a difficult subject matter for a director to approach, but still very much a taboo subject at the time for someone especially to poke fun at, I suppose, and testimony to the fact that quite often the best way to deal with great adversity and fear is to try and make fun of it.
Yeah. Host to a wide number of just landmark kind of comic moments, not just from Peter Sellers, but of course these lines like "you can't fight in here, this is the war room," all these kind of things. It's just a very sharp script. very well observed and very funny. Lots of great kind of physical touches of it as well. The kind of also Sellers' performance is just particularly is when he's playing Group Captain Lionel Mandrake, the stiff upper-lipped British officer who's the only sane man again in the whole room, and trying desperately to bargain with the man who's worried about bodily fluids.
As he's firing a 50 caliber machine gun out the window of his office at his own troops.
Yes. So many just wonderfully a little bit absurd situations that it finds itself in. If I am going to be the kind of critical one, which I suppose I should do, it's kind of my function here, is that it's a very broad satire. It's very obvious what it's doing. So while I don't think you'll really get a lot more out of it the next time you go back to it, like something like, I don't know, a Coen Brothers comedy where there's always kind of layers to kind of go through. This one is very very straightforward and direct, but that's no detriment to it. Certainly, as you probably learned from the first time watch it, it's just absolutely astonishing. A real comic tour de force.
There's no great nuance to those character performances. They are out and out sort of comic performances. And what surprised me about it is that I suppose people think of Kubrick as a very serious filmmaker, but on this evidence, he quite clearly has a sense of humour and an impeccable understanding of comedy and comic timing. I mean, it's not just down to his cast that this movie performed so successfully. And also, I tell you what was really interesting for me was that, as notorious a perfectionist as Kubrick was, and given his propensity for, doing sort of 60 plus takes of any given scene sort of quite routinely, Stanley Kubrick's, average number of takes across his career for any one given scene is probably in the region of about 30 to 40, if people's accounts are to be believed. And there's one or two points in this, and specifically there's a point at which, Peter Sellers as Dr. Strangelove is going into one of his fits in his wheelchair at the end, sort of trying to take control of his rogue arm, where Peter Buell, who plays the Russian ambassador, quite visibly corpses and is doing his best not to burst out laughing. And honestly, I wouldn't have expected that in a Stanley Kubrick film. I wouldn't have imagined he would be the kind of, given his reputation, that he would have let that anywhere near the final cut. But there's a real joy in this movie, and I like to think that everybody involved had, a really good time. Whether or not everybody did, I don't know. But, what just an outright, and crucially, I think, even though, this film is how old now? 1964, so 50, this film's over 50 years old now, and actually a lot of that comedy would feel fairly, although, as you say, it's painted in fairly broad strokes, it wouldn't be out of place in a sketch show or something today. It still feels quite fresh, and, it's just a really wonderful, quite rounded movie. As you say, I'm not sure if it will hold up, particularly well to repeat viewing, but to have watched this now at this point in my life, where I feel like, I'm of an age now where I kind of appreciate that humour around that situation, then I'm really glad that I watched Dr. Strangelove now. I feel bad about not having watched it sooner, but perhaps it was for the best, because I really, really thoroughly enjoyed it. Really enjoyed it, and I think it deserves all the praise that's been heaped on it, and then some.
Yeah, it certainly does, and I think pretty much from this point onwards we can. Maybe Eyes Wide Shut's an exception, but I can more or less uniformly say just you need to watch all of these films. Certainly from this point on in his career, all his films have something to warrant recommending them, and so you probably won't hear me say that anymore, because just take it as read. If you've not seen anything past Dr. Strangelove, you really should. But now we're getting into some of his more popular and well-regarded works.
Iconic works, yeah.
Yeah, so this is... but certainly Dr. Strangelove is a comic masterpiece, and definitely deserves looking at. And as you say, given that we still have nuclear weapons, the actual content matter of it hasn't really aged in the way you might expect something this.
Well, the way Putin's brandishing his dick at the moment, then it doesn't feel all that out of the question even now. Some of these B-52s are still flying as well, so yes. There you go.
Now, part of this podcasting gig was an attempt to broaden our cinematic horizons a bit and take on some films that we'd had either not seen for various reasons, or even some entire movements that we'd not seen fit to cram into our schedules. So that brings us to our episode in May of 2016, where we take a look at the French New Wave, and this one is from our Cahiers du Cinema podcast. And this review in particular is of the leading light of the New Wave genre, Jean-Luc Godard, his much lauded Breathless.
Now from Truffaut, we move on to another of the leading lights of the Cahiers du Cinema, Jean-Luc Godard, who along with Truffaut, is probably the other banner name that people not that familiar with it may well have heard of.
Captain of the Starship Enterprise. You've got to get it in there, haven't you?
You have, apparently. And what is his most famous film, possibly the most famous film in the French New Wave, which is A Bout de Souffle, also known in English as Breathless.
Yes, his Godard's first film, I believe, at least his first feature again. Commonly held up as the best the film has to offer, which is surprising, given that I'd argue that it's objectively terrible in several areas, but get ahead of himself.
I would argue that it's objectively beyond terrible. Please carry on.
Right, we're introduced to Michel, played by Jean-Paul Belmondo, who earns himself a promotion from petty thug to public enemy when he murders a policeman, seemingly in order to avoid a speeding ticket. Which
that's a pretty weak start, isn't it? There's no character motivation there at all.
It rather brings into question his risk-reward calculations, doesn't it? Well, anyway, Michel flees to Paris, hoping to lose himself amongst the crowds and also to reclaim some money that is owed to him to allow him to escape to Italy, I believe it was. While there, he becomes reacquainted with Patricia, played by Jean Seberg. I'll cut some of that out. She's an American student and would-be journalist, and Michel sets about seducing her, not just for the usual reasons, but also to gain another hiding place in Paris. However, his romantic options are rather limited by the police's ever-closing net as their manhunt shuts down Michel's options. There's a few problems for me in Breathless, and I suppose we'll deal with the conventional ones first, chiefly that Michel, despite his insistence that he's modelling himself on Humphrey Bogart, has all the magnetism of Humphrey Bogart's toenail clippings, and this unlikable murderous, misogynistic tool is not someone I want to see leading a film. The model may perhaps be closer to Jimmy Cagney's gangster roles, but Jean-Paul Belmondo ain't no Jimmy Cagney. Now, if the main influence that's trickled down from Breathless is the freedom to experiment with how films are made, we should at least raise the counterpoint that for a lot of the time, those things were done for pretty good reasons. Things like, for example, using a film stock that's actually available in usable quantities such that you're not stuck spicing 18-metre lengths of Ilford HPX photo stock together before shooting. Things like using some studio lights rather than just relying on natural light so that you don't have to push that film stock from ISO 400 up to 800. And this unorthodox choice of film stock severely limited the camera choice, which brings me to my greatest annoyance in the film. The Eclair Camiflex was the only camera able to function with this Franken film stock, and not only did it not synchronise sound recording, it sounds like an elephant skeleton falling down a metal staircase inside an echo chamber. So, near as damn it.
Oh, what a wonderful metaphor. So thank you, you've made my day.
So near as damn it, this entire film has been ADR'd, which is still actually a relatively common occurrence in these new wave films, given their penchant for guerrilla, permitless outdoor shootings. But here it's done so singularly ineptly. I try not to get hung up on technical flaws, especially from older films, but this is such a glaring annoyance that I cannot take any of this film seriously. None of the voices sound remotely like they're coming from the same room as the bodies, and what little Foley work there that isn't there is so badly mixed that it comes across as a parody. Likewise, Breathless may well be the start of the jump cut revolution, but its actual effect is a complete mixed bag. While it's used in some driving sequences in ways that are quite commonly used today, which does make it achingly contemporary, it's also rather puzzlingly used to absolutely no effect whatsoever in some dialogue scenes, which...
Oh, yes, the scene in the cafe in particular.
Yeah, it just makes it...
It cuts, it does like an edit more or less after every sentence.
Yeah.
It's driving me crazy.
Makes no sense, doesn't add anything, makes it looks like a badly produced YouTube vlog. I mean, the film overall is not completely without merit. Being the root of influence for most of these aspects of modern cinematic technique, it does have some legitimacy as a historical document, and there's an undeniable energy and vibrancy to it, but overall there's so much wrong with it that I couldn't even call it a decent film. Important? I might grant you that. Classic? Nope. Too much of it is much too rubbish to be mentioned in the same league as your Citizen Kanes or your Lawrences of Arabia's is. To be honest, I enjoyed it so little I can't even recommend it on a historical level. Read up on it if you like, but as a film, rather like most lower league football, it's a dismal 90 minutes.
Yes, I have nothing but issues with this film. First of all, I think this is genuinely a bad film. Yeah. Not just a film I didn't like much. I think it's objectively a very, very bad film. It's badly made. It's badly written. it's badly acted.
Yeah.
For me, there's so very little of merit in this. I mean, I think maybe the person who comes out of it with the least sin on their soul for this film is Jean Seberg.
Yeah.
And she's given a harder job to do too, because she's an American acting in this in what's not her first language.
Mm-hmm. And her character's likeable enough, to be fair, but unfortunately,
it's not the strongest character, but she's likeable enough. And even if you question some of her decisions, and I do actually particularly question some of her decisions in combination with my other big character issue with the film, and that's one you mentioned already, Jean-Paul Belmondo as Michel.
Jean-Paul Bellend, more like.
Exactly, I was going to say, he's a complete bellend. He is, from the very first scene, deeply unlikable. He has no charisma at all, to the point where even Dennis Quaid could struggle to play this role. And
your hatred for the Quaid knows no bounds.
No, I would try to fit it into as many podcasts as I possibly can. Preferably, legitimately, like I just have, but it's a challenge to myself.
Yeah, questionable legitimacy, I'd say there, but okay.
Yeah, Jean-Paul Belmondo, he has no charisma at all. His character is so thin.
Yeah. The
character motivations make no sense. He just murders a police officer because, but then there's never any suggestion later on that he is psychotic or that he's particularly scared, because he's so laid back for the rest of it.
Yeah.
That, like, it does not fit at all with the act that begins the film. So yeah, I say no charisma. The character's so thin. As almost everything about his character rubs me the wrong way. He thinks he's really cool and clever, and he's just a git.
Yeah.
He's just spectacularly irritating character. So then you add to that the lack of much story, although it's narratively maybe stronger than, say, Julie Jim, in terms of, like, you kind of see where it's going. That there's a thing, one falls on from the other a bit more strongly, but I don't like the characters. The technical aspects were doing my head in.
Yeah.
The constant jump cuts that added nothing. For instance, when it's at the start, when it's I still think it's pretty inexpertly done, although it's almost an experiment at that stage, coming a couple of years before, say, even like Doctor No tried doing a wee bit of jump cuts to a bit more effect, although it used them quite sparingly. That you've got in the exploring the use of that kind of editing to give it a bit more energy, make it a bit more frenetic. The car chase at the start, they fit, inexpertly done, but they make sense there.
Yeah.
But then that scene, in particular, the scene in the cafe that I mentioned, where he's talking and I know it's the guy that Gene Seberg's meeting with, sorry, is talking.
Yes, it's the other journalist fella, isn't it?
The other journalist, yeah. And then there's just, and I don't know whether part of that is simply because of, like, the technical restrictions, because they were using that very short run stock, so they couldn't get long takes, coupled with the fact that Goddard was feeding lines to the actors just before they started a scene to try and make everything as fresh as possible, which in most cases just comes across as ill-prepared. Which is okay when you're doing a silly podcast before anybody makes any smart comments, but when you're getting paid to make a film, maybe not so much. So yeah, they literally there's an edit after every sentence, sometimes even a half sentence during that scene, and I wanted to throw the film out of the window and somehow ceremoniously set fire to it, which is quite difficult to do with a digital file. But then you have problems with the sound, as you said, Scott, and even then the sync's still out in quite a lot of places, even with the ADR. Yeah,
it's really badly done. I mean, the technique itself has been used for decades. It's nothing inherently wrong with having the film ADR. It's just been done so badly. Mm-hmm. Like I say, I think there's 2 instances of making any attempt at having, like, room noise foleyed into it, and it sounds absolutely laughable. I did actually laugh out loud. They dubbed some train noise, I think it is, at one point. It's just so ludicrous, out of place. It just doesn't work at all. It's just really sloppily done. Yeah. Unforgivably bad.
Yeah, technically it's a shambles. Narratively, perhaps it's not too bad. It's character-wise, the other part of it's where it's really let down, because Michelle's character's so thin, this motivations make no sense. Then you have a complete pillock playing him. He's deeply unlikable throughout. And a couple other minor annoyances, but because I was already so against this film, it just kind of got my back up further. There's a scene at the very beginning of the film and one right at the end where the fourth wall is broken to no good end.
Yeah.
And it just drives me crazy. It's like, occasionally, a clever use of breaking the fourth wall can sort of put an edge into a film or even create humour, something like that. I don't, because there's only, I think, the 2 instances of it, and they're so sparing, and they add nothing to the film. I genuinely don't understand what they're in there for.
Yeah.
And we're not sure at all what Godard's trying to say or do with that. So for a film that's considered somehow a landmark, it's considered like the standout film of the French New Wave. It's the most famous one, and I genuinely don't understand why or how.
Yeah, in many ways I'm glad that it stands out, because then you know to avoid it quite easily.
Yes.
That's really my only explanation for it, but no, I could not get on with this at all. It's just badly made nonsense.
Unfortunately, this was one that I had bought. This was one of the other ones that I owned for years because of the reputation, and I was interested in sort of, again, broaden my horizons. So it took me 15 years after buying it to do it, but never mind that. It's kind of iconic artwork for it too, and it's always been sort of on the periphery of my knowledge of cinema. I've always been vaguely aware of this, and it's so iconic. Finally, yes, I'm going to make myself watch this. Like,
yes. Yes, unlike Citizen Kane, it did not live up to its hype in the slightest.
No, quite the opposite. Yes, I'm afraid not that you can possibly be in any doubt if you're listening to this, but if you want to check out the French New Wave, do not begin with Breathless. Do not put Breathless in the middle. Do not end with Breathless. Just avoid Breathless entirely. You'll be happier.
Do not collect $200. Do not, Pasco. October 2015 saw us taking a look at the various cinematic incarnations of Jack Ryan, and in particular the few we selected here today. It combines two of our favourite things, submarine movies and terrible Sean Connery accents. So let's dive straight into this review of The Hunt for Red October.
Bit of a potted history on celluloid and a recent attempt to reboot the franchise. Jack Ryan, the creation of Tom Clancy, has so far been the subject of no less than 5 celluloid ventures, coming in at something like, am I correct in saying, the 84th most lucrative film franchise to date? So not the top of the tree, but
the fact that you've looked that up at all is only slightly less baffling than that somebody would create that list in the first place. But okay.
Absolutely. You're just going to have to take my word for it. I've pulled that figure from completely off the top of my head. It's somewhere between 80th and 90th something. I don't know.
I assume
anyway,
that was sourced from the never wrong Wikipedia.
No. From the even less ever wrong IMDb trivia, probably. And we all know the veracity of that. So I guess... yeah, we all probably know the Jack Ryan movies, right? Or at least most people will be familiar with them in passing. But
I'm not even sure they wouldn't even know that name, some people, but I think Hunt for Red October, you'd mentioned people did vaguely know what you're aware of. It's certainly not an obscure thing by any means.
No, absolutely. So I guess, okay, so you've name-checked the first entry in the series, 1990's Hunt for Red October. So probably worthwhile kicking off with that first then. Submarine movie is probably the answer you'd get from most people. A couple of people I've asked actually haven't been aware of the fact it was a Jack Ryan movie. And there's probably a couple of reasons for that, but directed by John McTiernan, straight off the back of Die Hard, bringing along with him director of photography Jan de Bont. And watching the film again now, for the first time since probably it first came out, the thing that struck me immediately was quite how similar in terms of appearance to 1988's Die Hard. How can I forget what year Die Hard was? It must have been 1988. Yeah, thank God for that. Sorry.
Okay, now I'm doing myself.
I would have had to have punished myself if that was...
1988, yes, we're both right. We can allow ourselves to live.
Excellent. So coming straight off the success of Die Hard, McTiernan has handed this project. And for my money, actually, right off the bat, I'm just going to say that this is probably, by some margin, my favourite entry in the franchise.
Oh yeah, I'd have to agree with that, absolutely. Now, unlike you, I am not unfamiliar with it since it came out because I watch it all of the time. Well, bit of an exaggeration, but I do have a bit of a thing for submarine movies, and this is far and away my favourite. And
okay,
I've actually found that I just found this endlessly watchable. It's it's just like a really good thriller with, it's got a quality director who, having come off the back of Die Hard, as you say, at the top of his game, really. You've got very, very dependable cast. Sean Connery, who's Lithuanian is because people keep casting Sean Connery with accents he has probably never even heard of. But
I think that at the time and ever since, that's one of the things this movie's most remembered for, is that so many people seem to be hung up on Sean Connery's accent. It became something of a joke, and I actually find that a little bit unfair, to be honest with you, because I think in a movie where very few people are actually trying to put on Russian accents, I expected it from memory and from other people's poking fun at it. I really expected it to detract more from this recent viewing of the movie, and actually I found that it didn't at all. I didn't feel it was particularly out of place.
Well, see, even then, to be honest, I don't know if it's just because he can't do them, or I'm sort of more used to his real accent. I can always hear that underneath. I mentioned his accent, but it's not like he actually really puts one on in this.
No.
It must have been like the fourth or fifth time I watched The Untouchables to really notice that, he's actually trying an Irish accent in that, is he? Because people had told me that I'd never noticed because you couldn't tell.
Yeah.
And I think The Hunt for Red October was a bit the same there. And yeah, not that many people, as you say, are putting on an accent here. There's Peter Firth at the start, who also gives a go speaking a bit of Russian.
For a short while.
Sam Neill, and for the main cast, that's about it. It's like Tim Curry's basically being English in it.
Yeah, I sat there watching this, and I thought I made the mistake of sitting trying to take notes, and I got so far before I realised that I'm actually enjoying the film far too much to spend time taking notes. But, and I'll probably need to bleep this, but the first note I've made here, if I look at it, is fucking hell, Tim Curry is in this, which I don't remember at all, and he's not in some sort of camp role or some sort of scenery chewing overblown. It's one of the few sort of kind of straight, toned down performances I've seen from him.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a particularly remarkable performance, but it's entirely competent and quite. Well, not to say that Tim Curry's incompetent, but yeah, it's quite straight for him.
Yeah, I feel like it's fair to say that his more memorable performances have been when he's bordered on the sort of histrionic. That seems to be his stock in trade, and it was actually quite a surprise to see him pop up here because I had no recollection of him being in it. And that's probably to his credit, because if it had been some sort of overblown performance, then I surely would have remembered. And here he is, just a kind of functional, officer, sort of a reasonably high-ranking member of the crew who just sort of can't go, not to ruin anything, but knocks about performing his duties and keeps himself to himself for the most part.
I'm not going to go out to spoil things deliberately, but if you've not seen a 25-year-old film and we're talking about it as a retrospective, let's not worry too much about spoiling anything, okay?
So, besides the fact that Tim Curry is in this, playing, I think actually he's the ship's doctor, isn't he?
He is the doctor, yeah.
Yeah, he's the doctor, so there you go. I guess, yeah, being pleasantly surprised as I was about how well this film appears to have aged, I was genuinely taken aback, and I don't pay a great deal of heed to Metacritic scores because I generally tend to find that for any given value of Metacritic score, Metacritic is wrong. But that's the problem with taking an average. But yeah, I was actually quite surprised to see how fairly lowly ranked this was at around, I think, a score of about 58.
58 at the moment, yeah, which is, that's wrong.
Yeah, that really, and a lot of that, if you skip down the list, seems to be the fact that it's bottomed out by the Christian Science Monitor, scoring at 25. Yeah, but even taking that into account, I feel like, I guess a lot of these reviews were probably posted at the time, and I was actually surprised at how negative some of the reactions were.
Yeah, there's also possibly too, I think it's quite well known that Tom Clancy's never been particularly happy about how things have been handled in adaptations of his work. Not that's a particularly unusual thing to hear from an author, but given Tom Clancy's a right-wing nut job, I'm going to just happily ignore him anyway.
Well, it was. He popped his clogs, didn't he?
Yeah, last year, the year before. Yeah, so, because fortunately, I think it's easy to think that any military-based film can be considered right-wing, but I think for the large part, his politics, and I've never actually read any of his books, so maybe they're not in there either, but his politics never certainly seem to be in his films that much.
No, it has to be said that there's no sort of great right-wing agenda here. In fact, if anything, quite the opposite. It's
especially
the overwhelming message of this film is tolerance and understanding.
Absolutely, which comes back in like The Sum of All Fears too, very much the same sort of thing there, which is
very much
a bit more sort of liberal and wet, really, compared to right-wing hawks or anything.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so you're saying this has got some low scores again, which I don't understand because it's no Citizen Kane, obviously. Yeah. But It's an exceptionally competent action adventure thing, right? It's got really compelling performance from Sean Connery, who, as accent aside, is a great actor and it's very entertaining to watch.
And a $20,000 hairpiece.
Yeah. Then you've got Alec Baldwin just really starting to make his name in Hollywood, being really good in it.
Yeah, and that's the biggest shock of this, even more so than Tim Curry appearing, is that I'd forgotten young Alec Baldwin is like barely recognisable in this.
Yeah, there's sort of a heaviness to him. And I don't like in fantasy, it's because like sort of, he just seems a more weighty person, even from like Glengarry Glen Ross onwards. And in this, he's so slight, he's like a boy. And it's like, oh, it's just weird.
Yeah, it is really weird. It's almost as weird as the fact that when he leaves for his flight at the start of the film, he chooses to dress as a slightly updated Captain Birdseye. But that aside,
that's a metaphor. Analogy, rather.
That aside, actually, yeah. And the surprising thing for me as well is that given sort of, I suppose it's probably fair to say that, you know, in the period after this film, I guess Alec Baldwin's very much known as an alpha male character, right? And that's very much how he portrays himself. Actually, revisiting this film now for the first time since I was, well, I mean, I guess, you know, like in my early teens, really. Now with hindsight, I actually appreciate, I think that, and we'll come to talk about this a bit later, but I'd probably say that Alec Baldwin gives the best portrayal of Jack Ryan as well. I feel like he's, in this movie, he's not, he doesn't give the sort of, the wet behind the ears kind of the bizarre age versus experience thing that Harrison Ford, comes out with in his sort of muddled performances. He is a little bit wet behind the ears in this, Alec Baldwin. His inexperience shows through, but it never seems incompetent. He's just engaging enough. And he's also not given enough focus to detract from the actual, the ebb and flow of the movie itself. The movie sort of propels itself forward at this really quite certain pace, and I feel like his character's weighted just right so that you're always aware of his involvement, and he's part of driving that plot forward. In fact, he's a big part of it, but his performance never detracts from what's happening on screen.
No, it is pitched just right to him, and because and it seems to work for the character for me too, is that he's not cocky.
No.
He's not cocky at all. He's maybe even a bit unsure of himself, but he knows that he's right. He's got the courage of his convictions, but he's absolutely not arrogant about it.
Yeah.
And that comes across really well in Alec Baldwin's performance, I would say.
I think, refresh my memory here, because when I sat down to start watching these movies, and even after I watched them, I found myself sitting thinking, yeah, sorry, what exactly is Jack Ryan again? Is he CIA?
He's CIA, he's an analyst.
He's an analyst for the CIA.
Yeah, he's a former Marine, which, as it comes up in, this is the film that focuses.
They mention it at some point in this, isn't it?
Apart from Jack Ryan Shadow Recruit, because it shows what happens and sort of update the fact that he was had a helicopter crash in the Mediterranean. Then, you know, did the last year of his academy from the hospital and learned to walk again. So they give you a wee bit of a backstory there about this determination of the character.
Yeah.
So he's a CIA analyst, but he seems to have a kind of friendship with Admiral Greer, or sort of gets on his radar anyway. That is the kind of it's almost like he's become his protege. That seems to be it during the Harrison Ford ones, particularly. You get the feeling that they've been working together for a long time.
Yeah.
Sort of grooming him. Well, grooming's not great, training possibly. But yeah, CIA analyst who just in the wrong place at the wrong time, or possibly the right place at the right time, depending on your point of view.
I think I think the mistake people make in this film is I've seen a lot of criticism levelled at John McTiernan, saying that he brought none of his flair from and skill that he displayed in Die Hard to this movie, and I think that's really, really disingenuous. It's not that there aren't things wrong with this movie. I made a couple of notes, especially around the script. There's a tendency for the script in places to suddenly stall and indulge in exposition. I think the first instance of that is when Ryan goes to see the guy in the sub manufacturing facility for his opinion on the drive that they've noticed.
Yeah, there's that, because even just like a little bit just before that too, it's like, look at this little submarine he's testing. Pay attention. This will be important later.
Yeah, exactly. That's the note I've made. It's like, oh, what are you doing? Oh, I'm just putting this universal docking collar on a rescue sub so that it can dock with any sub. British, German, trails off. It's like, okay, I wonder if that's going to be important.
That's a little artless, that section, I would say, but
it is, and it hiccups every now and again as well. And again, people have pointed at McTiernan's direction and said, look, any sort of credit in this film really goes to Jan de Bont's cinematography. And let me be clear here as well that working together, John McTiernan and Jan de Bont, and this film probably even more than Die Hard, I think, and it must be to do with the confined spaces and the close focus. It's immediately apparent that he's shooting on anamorphic, and the style and the aesthetic of that lens in the sort of cramped atmosphere of the submarine is just phenomenal. Mm-hmm. And honestly, that anamorphic lens flare, which what's his chops, J.J. Abrams goes out of his way to fake with absolute abandon, like a kid with a squeaky button. Honestly, this is how it should be done. And I watched this film and I thought, I tell you what, this is what I can tell you now. This must be one of J.J. Abrams' touchstones for his visual style in that respect. But when you see it done properly here, actually with anamorphic equipment, which is the only way you legitimately get that kind of lens flare, it's a beautiful thing to behold. And actually, I find that for all the issues that the film has, minor issues, it's not necessarily the visual appeal that papers over them. I honestly think that John McTiernan's direction, it's nowhere near as workmanlike as some people make out. I actually think he deserves the credit for propelling the thing along at such a tight pace that you don't really care about those things so much. So yeah, credit where credit's due. I really, really enjoyed rewatching Red October, and I think I'm gonna drop it into a folder on my network drive somewhere, and I'm pretty sure I'll come back and watch it again.
Good man.
What is it? I mean, if you were to sum it up, what is it about this film? I mean, I know you're a fan of submarine films, but
I don't know. It's just I find that, and even though I've watched it so many times and I know how it ends and how it goes, I mean, I basically know this film off by heart. But I just find that every time I watch it, the tension still works. That I don't know. This will sound like damn it with faint praise, but it's just quite incredibly competent. And it really sounds like I'm underselling that there, but I just find that everything about it, I mean, it looks nice. I just love the claustrophobic feeling of being in a submarine, but without it being sort of overwhelmingly so. Then just like the characters are interesting, well played. Just I always find Sean Connery very watchable, but I don't know. Yes, I'm trying to think of something
more than the sum of its parts, probably.
Possibly more praiseworthy than it's competently done.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's just. It's good, isn't
it? You can't ask for more praise than that.
In our April 2016 intermission podcast, we took on the critically acclaimed movie The Assassin. It's an art house favourite, but what will our blue-collar sensibilities make of it? Next up on the list is The Assassin, from a director whose name I will struggle to pronounce. I think it's Sao Sen Hu.
I was going to say, let's take a stab at it. I decided last night that I would take a stab at it, and now I've lost the IMDb page.
Anyway, a highly celebrated director whose works has been on my to-watch list for some time, although I think this might actually be the first one I've caught up with. It's being pushed as a redefinition of the wushu genre, a la Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or House of the Flying Daggers, which I don't think is entirely the case, but anyway, I'm getting rather ahead of myself. Ni Yin Yang, played by Kyushu, is taken from her parents as a child and raised to be a peerless assassin. However, after suffering a sudden attack of morals and she refuses to kill a target in front of his son, she's sent back to the province of her birth with orders to kill the man that she had been promised to in marriage as a kid and still seemingly harbours feelings for. This man who is also in charge of the largest military forces in 7th century China. The film is set in 7th century China. It's not like in modern times or anything. That would be unusual if you still had someone being in charge of the largest military force in 7th century China if it wasn't set there. As a film, it looks stunningly gorgeous. And if this isn't the most attractively shot film of the year, then there's some treat awaiting us, but it would have to be something truly extraordinary. To a degree, it does call back to the previously mentioned films, with strong, bold, vibrant use of colour and painterly framing, often very sedately held for some time, and Hugh somewhat anachronistically using the Academy ratio, which gives the film a very distinctive look. Visually, it's an absolute treat, and I'm a sucker for this period. The detail's incredible, and the pacing, while it's sedate, held my attention, and the brief flurries of action are satisfying, and it's adroitly acted. Rather less edifying, I had only the loosest grasp on what was going on and who most of the characters were, or their relation to each other.
I'm glad I'm not the only one then.
That's all three of us.
I mean, from the recaps that I've read of the plot, it doesn't seem to be a particularly complex story,
Nope.
and I think I'm normally savvy enough to follow plots of this nature, so I don't know if it was just an off day from me, but your reaction heartens me a bit, but it just feels like the story is obfuscated somehow. I was just baffled by it. I'm not quite sure how.
Yeah. Obfuscated is the word that came to my mind as well, Scott, and possibly obtuse.
Yes. Also, it's perhaps more a criticism of coverage of the film rather than the film itself, but I'm not exceedingly clear as to why you would champion this as redefining work in the Wushu genre, unless you're happy with redefining, meaning leaving most of the genre out entirely. Yes. But that's a perfectly valid way to focus on the characters and the acting performance and the detail of the period and yada yada, all the stuff that I really liked on it, but that makes it a drama with the occasional Wushu element, not a Wushu film. It'd be like redefining the Fast and the Furious franchise by removing cars from the next film and making it about dirigibles. And while I'm entirely on board with an airship-based outing, calling it Fast and the Furious would be perverse.
The bloated and the ponderous.
Still, that said, for me at least, the positives do outweigh the negatives quite a bit, and I can recommend it just purely on the aesthetic principle alone. If you're less of a dummy than we are, you might even like the plot, but I'm not quite sure you'll be able to penetrate it. But yes, certainly distinctive. I enjoyed watching it, but I'm not entirely sure why I enjoyed it. I'm not entirely sure what I was enjoying.
I am very much of the opposite mind to you, Scott. It seems I've seen lots of people talk about how beautiful this film looks, and I think absolutely it does not. Visually, this film I did not like at all. I mean, there are a few undeniably beautiful shots, but for me, those were in spite of rather than due to the cinematography. You have striking landscapes that simply could not fail to be visually arresting no matter where you plonk the camera down within them. But most of the rest of the time, the scene composition is insipid. Mundane shots of trees in the middle of fields and scenes of sets containing the most beautiful rooms and glorious costumes presented with the most uninspired and lifeless camera work. And what that does is stop the film feeling like a film at all, but more like a series of still lifes joined together. No doubt that's an intentional choice, but for me that's just one that fails wholly in making The Assassin an enjoyable watch. I mean, it's also, and as you mentioned, it's a martial arts film that makes the bold move of largely eschewing martial arts. So I think people need to really update their genre dictionary when they're describing this. These issues, coupled with the fact that the characters are incredibly thin, and what little plot there is willfully obfuscated and obtuse for most of the film, as well as pacing so slow that the word tectonic, even more so than glacial, springs to mind, means that, for me, there's almost nothing worthy of recommendation in The Assassin. I would recommend avoiding it.
This is turning out to be one of our more interesting podcasts, because we're all over opinions here just now. I'm going to go straight ahead and say it's interesting to hear you guys struggle with the plot even though you were paying attention, because I had assumed that the reason I finished the movie and thought to myself what was all that about was I'd made up my mind that I knew why, and it's because I spent so much of my time with my eyes just sort of taking in detail and searching the frame that I wasn't paying attention to the subtitles on quite a lot of occasions, and I found myself completely bewildered within, I would say, the first 10 minutes. Like 10 seconds is probably closer to the truth, but like I'm surprised that you are entirely entitled to your opinion, Drew, as regards the cinematography, but I'm perhaps surprised by it because I think this is objectively a beautiful film. And I think compositionally, I was blown away by it. If I were going to take issue with anything, it's the stylistic choice of the use of saturation. And I'm intrigued to know what the process during the transfer and the grading was in this film, because when I watched it, I assumed it had been shot on digital, and it wasn't. It was shot on Kodak 35mm stock.
Digital intermediate, I think.
Yeah, digital intermediate. And it's interesting because the choices made, the use of oversaturation, was bordering on the objectionable in places, but for some reason it won me over. There's also this thing going on where I assumed it had been shot digitally, and also potentially some scenes had this slight whiff of HDR about them, but I'm going to assume that's not the case. It's as though quite a few of the scenes have been fairly subtly tone mapped or something instead, and the whole thing is so... This is going to sound potentially daft, but one of the things I noticed immediately about it is one of the sharpest movies that I've ever seen. The definition, the detail is absolutely incredible. And I'm going to go and assume that at some point in the grading or in the digital processing of the film stock that some form of sharpening might well have been applied, again as a stylistic choice, because I'm flabbergasted by it. I'd love to see it in the cinema. I'd love to see it in 4K just to see whether or not I can confirm my suspicions. But yeah, I mean, most of what I took away from this film was its visual flair. I found the pace of it actually... Films that are this slow burn can go one of two ways for me, and for me, The Assassin actually... I feel like it almost lucked out rather than anything else, but I found it was quite seductive in places. I found it was quite hypnotic, actually. And I actually really liked some of these shots where people have some dialogue or there'll be a clash and then people will just suddenly stop and stand and stare at each other for what feels like about 5 minutes while the camera sort of, sometimes it's entirely locked off, other times it's perhaps swaying about slightly, very gradually. There's something really hypnotic about it. I'm not sure how those stylistic choices serve the story, which, from what I gathered, was the story of one of the least successful assassins in history. Certainly the bottom half of the table, because in the course of the film, correct me if I'm wrong, our lead lady kills one person and
right.
resolutely fails to do away with anyone else throughout the entire course of the film.
And also, I really think assassins are supposed to be sort of stealthy. She seems to walk up to people she's going to kill, then say hiya and fail to kill them.
I kind of like the part where she just walks up to them and just kind of like springs out of a bush or just suddenly just strolls into the room and stands there for a bit until someone realises she's there. I kind of like the moxie of that, but it kind of goes a bit south when, for reasons that aren't necessarily always clear at the time, she just sort of stares at them, then turns around and just walks calmly away. It's not even that we're given this portrayal of inner turmoil that we can assess and say, all right, okay, yeah, oh, she's obviously got some issue there. Just there's this very almost robotic sensibility about the way she goes about her actions, where she'll just stop, stare, turn around, walk away again. What? It's interesting stylistically, but I'm not entirely sure how all of these stylistic choices are actually serving the plot. But then again, as I point out, I can't tell you what I can't tell you what the plot is. As you say, Scott, having read plot summaries of it afterwards, having read synopses of it afterwards, I'm like, oh yeah, that does sound like I shouldn't have had much problem following it with or without subtitles. But there you go. It's an interesting film, and for me it exceeds stylistically. But yeah, it's by no means a wushu movie. There are perhaps 2 examples at most of what might be classed as sort of what you might perceive as traditionally as being wushu, and even then they're very brief. There's almost no wire work or anything involved, to the point where they might as well not have bothered for some of the scenes. Instead of having 2 characters standing on a roof, they could have just had them meet in the street outside instead, and it would have saved the stunt guys setting up a wire rig for like half a day or whatever for the sake of a 10-second scene. But yeah, an interesting beast. I'm gonna say it was the best of the movies I watched this month, but that's damning with faint praise. Stylistically, I think a success almost in spite of itself. But yes, I'm perhaps baffled as to how it picked up Best Director at Cannes.
February 2016 saw us taking a look at the shadowy world of espionage, and in particular, this review is of the Jean Le Carre adaptation, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold.
I have found a new film to love, and it's 51 years young this year, I believe.
Yeah, the first Le Carre adaptation, I believe it was, certainly film-wise.
Yeah, and that film would be The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, the 1965 adaptation, in which Richard Burton plays Alec Leamas, the handler of Britain's undercover agents in Berlin at the height of the Cold War. Leamas has overseen a disastrous period for British agents in the city due to counter-operations by his German counterpart Munt, and when the last of his charges is killed while crossing the divide of the Berlin Wall on his way to debriefing, the hard-drinking chief is faced with a choice. Either walk away from his life in espionage or undertake one last very dangerous mission. Initially, it would seem that Leamas, and it's quite disorientingly, it initially seems that Leamas has chosen the former. But shortly we come to realise that he has in fact taken the one last job option, that being to convince the German agency that he has in fact decided to defect and is now in fear of execution by his own side. The Spy Who Came In From the Cold is one of those films that I keep hearing people talk about, and it's perpetually popping up in, recommendation lists, and for some reason, despite the fact it's in a genre that I really love, it's kind of a touchstone picture that's highly regarded in this genre that I love. For some reason, I've never come round to watching it. And it was only about a week ago that I watched this in preparation for the podcast, and man alive, what a film.
Yeah, I mean, I'd read the book, or the audiobook read to me at that point some time ago, and I liked it a lot. And then I think I watched, this was at the end of one of the TV adaptations, and that didn't really grab me very much. So I think that put me off further investigation of the film, but that was a stupid idea, as it turns out, because Spy Who Came In For Cold's amazing. All the car adaptations we're going to talk about here are brilliant. I don't know yet if this is better than Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. I think it actually might be, just because Richard Burton's performance is incredible, and also it's easily the most cynical and hard-edged of it.
Oh, yes.
This is the sort of real nasty side of the espionage game that's certainly towards the end, you think is perfectly believable and also really quite soul-destroying at the end of the day.
Well, it's predicate as some of the characters' motivations are in Tinker Sailor, Soldier Spy, or any number of these films tonight. So many of its characters' emotions and experiences are predicated on the fact they have a sneaking suspicion that they're obviously partaking in very dangerous work, but they're obviously in danger from the other side, but they almost always have a sneaking suspicion that they might be viewed as entirely expendable by their own side. And this is one of those films where that turns out to be the case for almost everybody. Mm-hmm. Sorry, spoiler alert. In a lot of cases in this movie, that sneaking suspicion turns out to be vindicated.
It's also got one of the more incredibly multi-layered plots that is going on in the sort of intrigue world. It's all very bluff and double bluff, but at the same time, it doesn't feel as though it's ludicrous. It feels like this is actually something that could very believably have happened.
Yeah, I think probably to the same extent as Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, it probably goes that deep into like you say, plot and counterplot and subterfuge and double dealing, but it to me, it didn't feel as complex as Tinker Tailor watching it. It didn't feel quite as dense. It was easier to digest, which I think is in its strength.
Which I think is unusual, because I think it is actually far more complicated, because at the heart, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy is, there is a mole, we need to find the mole. Where this is, in a way, we need to protect the mole by doing some seriously weird things. And the kind of multi-layered plot that goes on to do that really does kind of... It should be ridiculous, but somehow it isn't. It's all very believable, and even though it's taking place at a very high level, it all works. And that's quite an achievement, I think, to make that, have that believability filter through. And it's really just driven through, I think, mainly by Richard Burton, who is someone who I've not really seen a lot of, to my discredit for someone who does a film podcast, but in this film at least he is amazing.
I've seen a number of films that Richard Burton has happened to be in. I've never watched a movie because Richard Burton was in it. He's never been one of my favourite actors, as well regarded as he is, but yeah, I'm kind of a Richard Burton fan after this now, and I'm gonna the upshot of this is that I'm gonna go back and watch more Richard Burton movies, even ones that I've seen before, maybe dismissed them out of hand, because this for me really was the film where I'm like, wow, I get it. Richard Burton really could act.
Yeah, I don't know how much of it is leaning into his character. I mean, this is obviously a really cynical drunk that he's playing. I don't know if that is any reflection on his character at all. But
quite autobiographical, some of it is. Very aware of that, you know.
Undoubtedly so, but also highlights the fact there's a reason why this, Hollywood didn't come knocking on this drunk Welsh bloke's door for no reason. Elizabeth Taylor saw something in him.
What's weird about this film for me, though, is that Richard Burton's fantastic in it, right? The story is really good, especially the ending too, because you're completely blindsided by that. Yeah. You're not expecting that at all. Mm-hmm. I don't like this film, and I cannot work out why.
Really?
Really, yeah. I really, really don't like it. I'm bored by it, quite frankly. And that was when the first time I watched it a few years ago. I felt bored. I watched it again a couple of days ago, and I think, I'm going to like this. And I was like, nope. It still bored me, and I can't work out why, because everything about it I should like. I love slow burning stuff like that. I like John le Carre's work. I think Richard Burton's excellent, and I like the story. Mm-hmm. I just cannot get on with this film, and I don't know why.
That's all right. You don't need to justify that. Sometimes you just don't click with something.
No, but it's just strange, because I like the other le Carre stuff so much, and there are similarities in the structure, the pacing.
So the reason, the point at which I knew I was going to love this movie is when Richard Burton first meets Claire Bloom's character, Nan Perry, in what has to be the world's most specific reference library. This reference library is about the size of the room that I'm sitting in now. It has maybe 3 shelves. And I think, what was it he requests? He's looking to file a book, and it's like, oh yes, Metamorphosis, but specifically under lycanthropy. Like, right,
but it has a lycanthropy section. Yeah, that's...
yes. And I'm like, okay, it's got Richard Burton hammering the scotch, and it's got this uber specific reference library. I'm in. Whatever you've got to show me, I'm going all in. Here we go. I'm putting my faith in you, and I was rewarded richly. Oh dear. I think I can see why, actually, because there was a point in the first maybe 10, 15 minutes where I was kind of sitting in the fence a little bit, Drew, and I'm not sure what the tipping point was, but at some point I kind of found myself engrossed, and then bang, the credits were rolling, and I thought, Jesus Christ, where did the last 90 minutes go? But I can kind of see that if you weren't fully engaged by that point, then I get it, but I hope you go back and watch it again.
I've already watched it twice and didn't like it either time, so right. I don't know, I might, but I say, like, sort of rationally, everything about it I should like, but emotionally it never invested me. But
that sucker punch at the end, though, like, without spoiling anything, for a 51-year-old film, if you haven't seen it, if you don't, skip ahead a couple of minutes if you don't want anything spoiled for you. But that point at the end at which Nan Perry is shot trying to go over the wall, and Richard Burton has the opportunity to make it over, and he clearly just decides, to hell with this, what have I got anyway? That's everything I'd invested myself in, and any hope I had of a normal life after this just slumped down on the other side of this wall dead. I'm going with her. That really took me unawares, because as you said, Scott, that cynicism that runs through a lot of these films and the expendability of people, you always assume that cynicism is going to extend to the main character. And I think it's perhaps the only time in a film, whether it's been of this genre, whether it's been an adaptation of a novel or not, that I've seen that main character faced with that decision, and I automatically assumed he would just say, well, look, that's what happens, that's the game we're in, and rather than proceed with cynicism and just brush it off, as we've seen a million times in Bond movies, we've been conditioned just to accept that the good guys, if he is going to feel bad about it at all, is just kind of man up and get on with it. For this guy to decide, what is there past this anyway, I can't be bothered anymore, and just allow himself to be shot, was really a sucker punch for me. I did not see that coming at all.
Yeah, that had been exactly what I was going to talk about too, and it's what Scott mentioned earlier too, about sort of you not really knowing what's coming in this sort of film. Again, with the stakes being lower too, that you can be completely blindsided by something like this, that you're not expecting the hero to do anything like this at all, or for that to have happened, that the whole thing was a setup and the woman was expendable and they were always expecting her to die, but he never knew that, and he'd stopped being this great spy and not paid attention to stuff like that he should have known. And it's so well crafted. It's such a good story, and it's kind of disappointed that I don't like it more. But
Well, the thing of it is, as well, I think you kind of should see it coming, because when he's afforded the opportunity to undertake this mission at the start by his own boss, he makes it very clear that, look, you can do this if you want. I'm essentially going to be using you as a means to an end. And Lemus undertakes that. So really the signs are kind of there, but you still, I guess, whether it's conditioning or, whatever it is, you still don't expect that. It's a movie. Of course you don't expect, the hero to make such not a terrible decision. Clearly it was the right decision for him at the time. To make such a counterintuitive decision, really was. I'm surprised that a movie this old had the power to do that. It was something I hadn't seen before.
Another pick now from our February 2016 intermission episode, which saw the review of a good number of films and a number of Oscar contenders at the time. And one of the most lauded and hyped films at the time was the Leonardo DiCaprio starring The Revenant. So let's see what that's all about.
Okay then, so yet more awards bait. Once again for Alejandro González Iñárritu. This time The Revenant. Right, before I swear if I start speaking about The Revenant and using the word pish a lot, Scott, maybe you could tell us a little about The Revenant.
We are transported back to the 1820s, and a group of trappers, one of which is Leonardo DiCaprio's character Hugh Glass, who's kind of leading this exposition, at least in terms of the tracking and such like, is wandering around in the snowy wastes, at which point they're come across by a bunch of Native Americans who launch a surprise attack and kill an awful lot of the group that was going there. The survivors include, of course, DiCaprio himself, and you have Tom Hardy as John Fitzgerald, another trapper, Hugh Glass's son, who is Hawk, who also is half Native American, and Will Poulter as Jim Bridger, who's the youngest member of the party, and they're nominally led by Domhnall Gleeson's Andrew Hendry as the kind of captain of the party. So these guys escape and manage to shovel off downriver, but soon more tragedies befall poor Hugh. He's scouting ahead when he's mauled by a grizzly bear. Impressively manages to take him with her, but he's left very badly wounded, and while the rest of the party, after trying to carry his not quite lifeless body back for some distance, they eventually decide that they're not going to be able to make it. They're not going to be able to escape the Native Americans who are tracking them unless they leave him to his fate. He's left behind with Tom Hardy and Will Poulter and his son to kind of see him off and give him a proper burial, but that goes a little bit astray when Tom Hardy's character decides he can't quite be bothered with this whole waiting nonsense and engineers things to speed things up, largely by killing Glass's son, and turns out he didn't do quite a good enough job. Hugh pulls himself out of his grave and somehow manages to convalesce and start tracking down John Fitzgerald, Tom Hardy's character, with the thought of extracting vengeance upon him. I have very little to say about The Revenant. It's another film that was just there for me. It sounds very much like you're going to rip into it, and I'm tempted just to yield the floor to you. I thought it was okay, but I didn't think anything particularly much of it one way or the other, to be honest with you. It didn't really hold my attention particularly well. Sure, it's a kind of an impressive tale of survival, I suppose, but it just didn't really make any real impact on me, and I didn't really care an awful lot about any of it. Sounds like you may have some rather stronger views, so perhaps I'll let you get into it.
Actually, to be honest, no. For the most part, I didn't care about it. I'm more slightly angry about everybody talking about Iñárritu getting Best Director again, or it being Best Picture, or Leonardo DiCaprio getting a Best Actor Oscar, and I keep thinking, why? Why would that be the case? Nothing happens in this film. Nobody does anything, and then it ends. This film just didn't engage me at all. It's really boring. Nothing much of import happens at all. Leonardo DiCaprio has been talked up for actor, and I like Leonardo DiCaprio a great deal, and really I think he ought to have received an Oscar for The Wolf of Wall Street, in which he's utterly fantastic. Yeah. In this film, it's not that he's not fantastic, he's got sod all to do. Yeah. He barely speaks, he just lies there for most of the film. Tom Hardy comes out of it a bit better, but he does, for a good 50% of the film, sound like Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs in the way he speaks. It was driving me crazy for a good half hour. It's like, who does he remind me of? Who does he remind me of? Like, I know what it is. He's going to ask somebody to put the lotion on their skin in a moment. That's what it is. I just simply didn't care about anything that was happening. I didn't care about any of the characters because there basically weren't any. I mean, there are no characters in this film. It's what really irritated me about it, I think. For the rest of it, I simply wasn't engaged, but there are no characters. There are just some men, and they're in the woods, and then there's a bear. Yeah.
And then there's a bear.
Yeah.
That's a whole story's
I think
end.
I'm supposed to be shocked by the things that happened to Leonardo DiCaprio, but he's not anybody you've had any reason to care about up to that point, so why would you? No. Nobody, because apart from the fact that people barely speak in the film for most of it, Leonardo DiCaprio is just a person who's on screen along with some other people who are on screen, and the men have some men with beards, and they're in the woods, and then there's a bear. Okay. I like bears. I like the bear immediately because it's a bear. But yeah, so it's just a really, really boring film. It's shot nicely. That's the one thing you can maybe say for it. It's got nice photography. Even though I questioned quite why some of the camera moves were what they were, but it's a pretty film. And then there's a bear. And to be honest, if there'd been more bears, maybe it'd be more exciting. But if Leonardo DiCaprio gets an Oscar for this, it'll be because he didn't get it for The Wolf of Wall Street and should have done. It'd be a make-good Oscar, which we've seen more than once before. There isn't really a great deal of direction happening in the film. Nothing of anything important happens in the film at all. And I think it's kind of telling that the bits that I remember most are the bits that were driving me kind of crazy because they made no sense. It's like nothing of the characters stuck with me really because they don't have any. But there is one point when Leonardo DiCaprio is absolutely starving and he finds a bison carcass that he's been sharing with a Native American, and he eats bits of this bison raw when he's 2 feet away from a fire, and that's like, that's my abiding memory of that. It's like, I didn't care that this character had been starving. It's like, why is he not cooking it? There's a fire right there. So yes, that exercised me a bit, and the rest of it mostly passed me by because I didn't care about anything or anybody in it. It's another one I was utterly baffled by the awards buzz for. There was nothing awards worthy for this. I can't for life of me
see why you'd have DiCaprio up for a Best Actor. I mean, his performance in this is grimace.
Yeah.
I mean, understandably why he would do that, but I mean, that's all he's doing for like, what, an hour and a half of this film is him grimacing.
And it genuinely isn't a criticism of Leonardo DiCaprio. He doesn't have anything to do. He doesn't have a character, right? And it's not even like, the big problem with the story is it's not even like you can say it hasn't been directed. There's nothing to direct. Nothing happens. There's no story. That's why I feel like I'm getting a bit shrill here, because I'm now, maybe I'm laying into a wee bit of Scott. There was no story in this film. So there was no acting. There was no character. There was no direction to be done, because nothing happens. And then there's a bear.
I mean, certainly if you compare this to, I mean, his last film was Birdman, which you've got your issues with, but I mean, that had so much excitement and so much character back and forth. It had so much going on. It had lots of lovely little touches, and this, in comparison, is very static and very one note, and it doesn't really have anything that grabbed your attention. And it's at 2 hours 36 minutes. It needs more than this, but I mean, that is a very long sludge in the middle of this film.
It's at least an hour too long. To be honest with you, Scott, this film is actually an hour and a half too long.
Yeah, it's not far off it, isn't it?
When we discussed Birdman, I did mention it's like I like and also don't like Birdman, and I've never quite made up my mind. I've not seen it a second time yet, but I do want to. But Birdman is undeniably interesting. Now, whether you like it or not, that's a separate issue. But there's a lot going on there. The performances are definitely compelling and interesting. There's a story to it. There's a lot going on. There's things that are actually happening in that film, none of which is the case with The Revenant.
Yeah, there's no spark and no energy in The Revenant at
all.
all.
There's no anything in The Revenant, and then there's a bear.
I mean, let's not minimise the bear. That was a really good bit. That was a good bit of bear action, but the rest of the film, not so much.
Yeah, I think I probably would be less annoyed about this if it hadn't been talked up about for awards again, and not just because it's Iñárritu getting talked up for awards, because they're always never worthy, but it's been happening for years now. But it's just that every time it comes to this time of year, it's why I hate the Oscars. I just don't care about it. I used to, and I have no idea now why. It's because they just keep giving stuff to the wrong people. And even if it was like just the wrong people were giving it to, maybe that wouldn't be so bad. But it's the films they nominate, and you're like, but there's nothing in it. Why? Why have you nominated this? There's nothing here. It's not like it's maybe something you'd like disagree on, whether you think it's a good performance or a good story or something. There is no story. There is no performance. Leonardo DiCaprio for half the film is lying unconscious. And there's a bear. And I keep coming back to it because it's the only thing that has actually any life in it.
So we're nominating it for the Oscar for Best Bear. But the rest of it we're not so sold on. That's what we're saying there.
That's about the size of it.
And we will round things off today with a clip from our July 2016 episode on disaster movies. And in this one, we're talking about the frankly laughable The Swarm.
Now, Scott, you're a fan of The Swarm. Don't lie, you've got a soft spot for The Swarm.
It is the best of films, it is the worst of films. Mainly it's the worst of films. Actually,
whereas Meteor was so bad it's bad, The Swarm is so bad it's good.
Yes.
There's a clear distinction.
This really only made the list in the last...
I beg to differ.
I think this only got back on list because our friends at the Magic Lantern podcast,
Erica Long and Cole Relaine.
Yes, Erica Long in particular mentioned that she was a fan of how terrible The Swarm is, and so we put it on because, well, we have some history with the film from the days when we were running around in school doing Michael Caine impersonations ceaselessly.
Yeah,
that's more or less one of them. The history, really is just.
Yes. Basically, we liked doing terrible Michael Caine impersonations. The Swarm is about, of course, as you might expect. Well,
although sorry, just before you go, I hadn't seen The Swarm until just a few years ago for the first time.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God! Bees, millions of bees.
But Echo wanted base. Bees.
Well, I was just so disappointed by them. Was one of the lines you'd both been like quoting for years isn't even in the film, and I was devastated.
Yeah, so this is perhaps where the wheels come off the genre
African
for a while.
Killer bees.
We've been through fire, earth, water, and likes of airport take care of the fourth element, air as well. So the only choice for disaster then, obviously, is bees. An unlikely choice for the fifth element.
The industrious worker bee.
Yes.
Albeit of the killer African variant.
Yes, so Michael Caine steps up to combat the menace of the African killer bee largely through the medium of shouting, as top entomologist Brad Crane. who is
Brad Crane.
That's
a stupid name for Michael Caine.
my name is Brad.
That's it. I'm Brad. No, you're not. And I want to warn you about the African killer bee.
So he is found in a somewhat unbelievable fashion in the middle of a missile silo, which has recently been destroyed by bees. And
Clearly, the work of bees.
so Richard Widmark's General Slater shows up to investigate it, thus asking Michael Caine if he's American, with the response, yes. For the last 8 years, he has been American.
Which conveniently explains away my reluctance to do an accent.
Yes, so a lot of the early running is Brad trying to attempt to get the higher-ups, including the president, to believe that there is actually a swarm of African killer bees, and he's very insistent that they be called African killer bees for some reason.
Because otherwise you wouldn't be worried about it. It's very important, I must reiterate, they are killer.
There's a subplot which is largely ignored towards the end, where Widmark's not trusting Crane. He gets one of his subordinates to keep tabs on him, and I take this to mean that Widmark suspects that Crane is in league with the bees, or is perhaps a bee in disguise.
Was it suggesting he is a bee?
Yes.
That's it. Maybe that's where the line is. It's all right, Widmark. I'm not a bee.
And so it goes, with Crane and the assembled scientists trying to come up with ways to kill the bees without destroying everything around it, where the bees, for some reason, slowly buzz towards Houston, killing everything in their way, because this film has no idea what a bee is or what a bee does.
But they're killer bees. They kill. So they're not in the business of making honey like regular bees.
What's especially annoying is at some point during this film, Crane gives a very impassioned plea that you shouldn't ascribe your human moralistic views to what a bee will do. And then it's clear that the only explanation for anything that happens that the bees do is because it's been written by a human with no idea what a bee does.
Well, in fairness, it was originally about wasps. It's a search and replace.
So, like,
wasps aren't so hot right now. People are more into bees. Oh, all right. Control F. Right. Search for wasp.
There's an almost believable bit at the start where what's happening is they're up in a hive, and then someone disturbs the hive, and that's why they start going off in a swarm. But everything after that
That's
makes
a short movie.
no sense after that, because it's written by humans in a really ham-fisted way to make up the stakes, including causing an off-camera nuclear meltdown at a power plant.
Are you
suggesting it should be written by bees?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to ask. Are you advocating it should be written by bees?
It couldn't have been any worse.
I'm glad you mentioned the nuclear power station, because it's absolutely my favourite bit of that film, that they somehow cause an explosion at a nuclear power station by, as far as I can tell, irritating a man to flop over a console of buttons.
The self-destruct button.
Oh no, any button but that one.
Right. Yeah, so despite
So we should in fact thank our insect brethren for showing up the design flaw of a nuclear power plant that incorporates a self-destruct button.
Oh my days.
So despite a reasonable budget, its production values are of no value whatsoever, its special effects are in no way special, I think, topping out with hallucinations of giant bees that their stings apparently cause, which I'm sure is 100% scientifically accurate.
But you don't think the special effects of having buckets full of freeze-dried bees being thrown from off camera is amazing use of money?
Despite the nuclear meltdown, no meltdown for you on film, and nor when the order towards the end is given to burn Houston, are you getting any more than 6 boys running around in beekeeper outfits with flamethrowers. Sure, that'll work, because it's a very small place, Houston. I'm sure that's adequate to treat that particular scenario.
And it's good that the bees can't fly anywhere.
No, it's glad that we can be glad that they've got no means of escape.
So, I mean, I guess Michael Caine is treating this with the contempt that it deserves, but it's very much a low point in his career. There's a lot of films that we talk about where the dialogue's terrible. This is the worst.
But at the same time, the best.
Yes.
Oh my God! I need to put that back as a message alert on my phone. I haven't had that for a few years now.
The only other thing I don't remember much about this film. I think it's just fortunate. It's probably I've saved myself here. I think it's probably a nuclear power plant, but the coloured suits they wear just made me think of an Intel advert every time I saw them. Remember those Intel adverts where they play that funky music, White Man, and always like multicolour suits? It looked exactly like that, but from like 20 years earlier.
Yes, this film is hot garbage of the lowest order, but it's actually the sort of film that I think everyone should see once, even if you're not normally the person who subscribes to ironically watching bad films.
Very much.
This really does deserve to be seen on that basis. It's
very much in the way it's important that we
movie.
teach our children about the Holocaust even these days. You know,
I know I disagreed earlier, but thinking back, it's one of those films probably is really so bad it's good. It's like, you can sort of farce watch this thing.
Special anti-thanks to whatever clown decided that home releases should be 2.5 hours long rather than the cinematic cut of 116 minutes, which is itself 115 minutes too long.
What are the differences between the home release and the cinematic print?
I assume it's much worse because there's more of it. I didn't look for a detailed cut list, no.
Well, this film needs us to be fleshed out a bit more.
We need to understand the bee's character a bit more.
We need a bit of backstory behind the bees. What's their motivation?
Maybe we see some young bees who are normally in the straight and narrow but get cultivated by some
That's right.
thuggish older bees.
We need to see how the bees are radicalised. Oh my days. Oh, I've really enjoyed talking about the swarm.
African killer bees, Black Watch.
It's much more enjoyable to talk about than watch.
Yes. So that brings us to the end of this little episode. I hope you found something to enjoy in there. Hopefully something you've not heard before. If any of that piqued your interest, you can certainly go back to our website, fudsonfilm.com. Take a look back through the archives and see if there's anything there you'd like to download, or just consult the previous episodes on your podcasting software of choice. We should be back to our regularly scheduled podcast soon, so stay tuned for that. If you have any inclination to contact us about anything you've heard today or anything else, hit us up on the social medias. That's facebook.com/fudsonfilm, twitter.com/fudsonfilm, or you can even just email us. That's podcast@fudsonfilm.com. So, I've been Scott Morris, and until next time, take care. We'll see you down the line.